A mother's love is the purest thing in the world, or so they say. But what happens when that love turns into something far more dangerous? Something deadly? On the surface, it was a case of a simple poisoning, a crime of passion, a calculated murder, or something far more sinister, something hidden behind the veil of family, faith and deception. I thought I had seen everything, until I met Madame Derard. This is not just a story of murder, it is a story of guilt, sacrifice, and a secret buried so deep, even the greatest detective almost missed it. It was a merciless night. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, whispering secrets only the darkness could understand. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the old manor, a rhythmic assault that masked the eerie creaks from the wooden floorboards beneath us. A fire crackled in the grand stone hearth, throwing flickering shadows on the richly paneled walls. Across from me, reclined in his favorite chair, was the great detective Lucien Devereux. His fingers traced the rim of his porcelain cup, filled with a dark velvety brew that I knew carried the bitterness of unsolved cases. I, on the other hand, nursed a glass of warm brandy, feeling its heat seep into my bones. A storm like this, I mused, stretching my legs towards the fire, feels like a prelude to something sinister. Devereux gave a slow, knowing smile, his piercing gaze meeting mine. Every storm carries its secrets, my friend, and some have the power to resurrect the past. I raised an eyebrow. You speak as if recalling something specific. His smile faded, replaced by an expression I had rarely seen on his face, hesitation. He exhaled deeply, swirling the liquid in his cup. I have solved countless mysteries, he admitted, but there was one case, one night that still haunts me, a night where I was not the hunter, but the hunted, a night where I failed. The firelight glinted off his sharp features as he leaned forward, his voice lowering to a whisper. It began just like tonight, with a knock at my door and a box, a simple, elegant box tied with crimson ribbon, but what lay inside was far from simple. His fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles whitening. Inside was a single chocolate, nestled in gold foil, a chocolate laced with death. The storm raged outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm that now flickered in Devereux's eyes, and as he began his tale, I felt the weight of something far more dangerous than the night pressing in around us. It was no secret, though few dared to say it aloud, that the coveted ministerial seat was within his grasp. His rise through the political ranks had been swift, his influence undeniable, but power bred enemies, and none were more ruthless than those who opposed him. He was a man of contradictions, disciplined in habit yet careless in morality, unyielding in principle yet shadowed by whispers of scandal. Years ago he had wed a woman from Brussels, a marriage of convenience rather than affection. She had brought him wealth, status, and some said in hushed voices, misfortune. Within 2 years she was dead, a tragic accident, a fall down the grand staircase of their home on the Avenue Royale. No one questioned it, at least not aloud. His own death came suddenly, mere hours after an opulent dinner, on the very night the minister he was meant to replace resigned. The newspapers spoke of heart failure, a cruel twist of fate for a man poised for greatness. But I, Lucien Duval, former inspector of the Belgian police, knew fate was rarely so neat. I had no personal stake in his demise. If anything, I had little sympathy for the man. But 3 days later, just as I had settled into my long-awaited holiday, a visitor arrived at my apartment. She was veiled, her silhouette delicate against the dim candlelight. Yet there was something in her stance, poised, restrained, yet undeniably urgent. You are Monsieur Duval. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of something unspoken. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated, glancing toward the darkened window before whispering, "Then I have come just in time. There is something you must know. His death, it was no accident." The fire crackled, casting her shadow across the walls. In that moment, I realized my quiet vacation had ended before it even began. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the request with a quiet formality. "I am no longer actively serving in the force, mademoiselle," I said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She obliged, lowering herself onto the chair with an air of urgency. Then, with a trembling hand, she lifted her veil. She was young, strikingly so, but sorrow had left its mark upon her delicate features. Her eyes, dark with unshed tears, held a restless anxiety, as if she carried a secret too heavy for her frame. "Monsieur Duval," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have come to ask for your help. I know you are on leave. That is why I seek you now. You are not bound by official duties at the moment, and I do not wish to involve the police, not yet." I frowned slightly. "That is not how I operate, mademoiselle. Even on vacation, I remain an officer of the law." She leaned forward, desperation evident in her every movement. "I do not ask you to break your oath," she insisted. "I only ask you to investigate. If my suspicions prove correct, then you may take your findings to the authorities, but I need someone who will look beyond the obvious, someone who will see the truth." There was something in her tone, a quiet conviction that made me pause. After a moment of consideration, I nodded. "Very well. Tell me everything." A faint flush colored her pale cheeks, and she exhaled, as if relieved. "It is the death of Monsieur Laurent Beaumont that I ask you to investigate." I stiffened slightly at the name. Beaumont, the minister's successor, but his death was ruled natural, heart failure. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Doctors can be mistaken," she murmured. "You did not know him, monsieur, but I did. He was not a man who would simply fall dead after an evening meal. He was strong, full of life, and yet within an hour he was gone." I studied her carefully. "What makes you so certain?" She hesitated, then barely above a whisper she said, "Because I saw something that night, something I was not meant to see." A slow chill crept down my spine. "What did you see, mademoiselle?" She swallowed, glancing at the darkened window as though afraid someone might be listening. Then finally she spoke. "A shadow," she whispered. "A figure moving through the corridors of the house, just moments before he died. And I swear to you, monsieur, whoever it was, they were carrying a small unmarked vial." The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows along the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the dimly lit room, an even darker storm was beginning to form, one that had nothing to do with the weather. "The household is small," she continued, her voice steady despite the fear lurking in her eyes. "There are only the servants, Shin, Felice, and Denise, the cook, who has been with the family for years. The others are simple girls from the countryside, unremarkable. Then there is François, the valet, loyal, quiet, but secretive in his way. And of course, there is Madame Beaumont, Laurent's mother, who still resides in the house. She is frail, withdrawn, barely aware of the world beyond her own memories." She paused, exhaling slowly before continuing. "And then, there is myself. My name is Véran Menard. I am a poor cousin of the late Madame Beaumont, Laurent's wife. I have lived here for 3 years, a quiet observer of the household's affairs." I studied her intently. "Is that everyone?" "No," she admitted. "There were also 2 guests the night he died. Monsieur de Salade, a French acquaintance of Laurent's from his years in politics, and an Englishman, Mr. John Wilson, a friend from his travels." "Are they still here?" "Mr. Wilson, yes, but de Salade departed yesterday, rather suddenly, I might add." I leaned back, absorbing the information. "And what is it exactly that you wish me to do, Mademoiselle Menard?" She hesitated before answering, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. "If you will present yourself at the house in half an hour, I will have arranged for your arrival. I shall tell them you are a journalist from Paris, sent with a letter of introduction from Monsieur de Salade himself. No one will question it. Madame Beaumont is too ill to notice details, and the others will assume you are here for harmless inquiries." It was a clever ruse, one that might work. I gave her a small nod. "Very well." And so, half an hour later, under the guise of an inquisitive writer from the Parisian press, I was admitted into the house. It was a grand yet decaying residence, filled with the scent of old books, dying roses, and something else, something almost metallic in the air, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of long-buried secrets. Madame Beaumont was as Varenne had described, an imposing woman, once formidable, but now reduced to a frail whisper of her former self. Her presence still commanded respect, but her eyes, dulled by illness, saw little. Our conversation was brief, perfunctory. She cared little for a journalist's questions, And then I was left to my own devices. I wandered through the corridors of that vast house, each step deepening the weight of my task. Laurent Beaumont had been dead for 3 days. If foul play had been involved, only one method seemed likely: poison. Yet the body was already buried, far from my reach. The dinner plates had been cleaned, the glasses washed, the traces of that fateful evening wiped away. I had no evidence, no physical proof, only whispers, only shadows, only a lingering sense that something was terribly, terribly wrong. And I knew without a doubt that whoever had killed Laurent Beaumont was still inside these walls. I was working with shadows, the kind that slithered through the cracks of truth, hiding just beneath the surface of polite words and well-rehearsed alibis. Laurent Beaumont had been dead for 3 days. Poison was my only suspect. But how, and more importantly, who? The first step was to reconstruct the evening. I called upon the household staff, watching their faces as they recounted the details, searching for hesitation, for a flicker of something unspoken. Dinner had been a simple affair. The soup was ladled out by Beaumont himself, hot, steaming, impossible to tamper with unnoticed. The main course, cutlets, then a roasted chicken, followed by a compote of fruit, all dishes placed on the table for serving. The coffee, thick and dark, had been brought in a large pot. No servant had handled it in secret. No single plate had been prepared separately. If poison had been used, then everyone at the table should have fallen victim. But only one man had died. After dinner, Madame Beaumont had retired early, her frail health demanding solitude. Varenne had accompanied her, leaving only the men, Laurent, his French guest Dessalades, and an Englishman, John Wilson, to linger in the study. They had talked, laughed, sipped their drinks, and then without warning, Laurent collapsed. Dessalades had been the first to react. He rushed to summon François, the valet, shouting for a doctor, but by the time medical aid arrived, it was too late. Apoplexy. The physician had ruled a natural death. I was not so sure. Mademoiselle Varenne introduced me to John Wilson, a man as solid and unyielding as the British reputation itself. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Broad shoulders, thick hands, a bluntness that was neither unkind nor warm. His French was clumsy but serviceable. A terrible thing, he said, shaking his head. One moment, the man was alive and well, the next gone. No warning, no signs. You saw nothing unusual? I asked. Not a thing. He poured his own drink, just as we did. He ate what we ate. If you ask me, the doctors are right. His heart simply gave out. His words were straightforward, logical, and yet I felt the lie lurking in the spaces between them. Not in his voice, but in the way he avoided my gaze, the way his fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm on the armrest of his chair, a nervous habit, or the weight of a secret pressing against his skin. As I walked through the halls of the Beaumont estate, the house whispered to me. It was not done speaking. Not yet. Somewhere buried beneath these carefully placed words and convenient explanations was the truth. I only had to dig deep enough to find it. The moment Laurent Beaumont collapsed, the room had frozen. A man who had shown no signs of illness, no weakness, had crumpled like a puppet with its strings severed. It was too sudden, too unnatural. I retraced his final steps, scanning every corner of the study, searching for something, anything, that could confirm Mademoiselle Varenne's fears. But the room yielded no secrets, no stray vial of poison, no overturned glass, no sign of struggle. If he had been murdered, it had been done with the precision of a master. Doubt clawed at me. Had Varenne simply been blinded by grief? Was this an illusion, a desperate refusal to accept that death, sometimes, arrived without warning? Frustrated, I threw myself into the chair where Beaumont had sat in his final moments. Nothing, I muttered under my breath. Not a single clue. Everything is. And then I saw it. A box of chocolates, untouched, sitting neatly on the table. At first glance, it was unremarkable, but my detective's eye caught the inconsistency immediately. The box was pale pink, the lid, sky blue. That was wrong. Boxes came adorned with ribbons of contrasting colors, certainly, but a mismatched lid and base. That was unnatural, deliberate. I lifted the lid. Every chocolate was in place, not a single piece missing, a curious detail, because François, the valet, had just informed me that Laurent Beaumont had an insatiable sweet tooth. He never drank, never indulged in vices, but chocolates were his one weakness, yet he hadn't touched this box. Why? I turned to François, my gaze sharp. When did this arrive? He hesitated, thinking, "That before Monsieur passed, sir. It came with the afternoon post." "Who sent it?" François shook his head. There was no note, no name, a silent gift, an anonymous offering, a man who adored sweets, yet had not eaten a single one. I could feel it now, the truth, slithering just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Someone had meant for Laurent Beaumont to open that box, to eat, to die, and the real question was, who had stopped him? The moment François placed the dust-covered box in my hands, I knew I was close to something dark, something deliberately hidden. The lid was pink, the box was blue, a perfect inverse of the new untouched box in the study, a detail so small it could be dismissed by anyone, but not by me. I turned to François. "You say Monsieur Beaumont finished this box on the day he died?" "Why, monsieur, that morning, there were only a few left, and he ate them as usual." "Yes, after dinner, as always." I pressed the lid down firmly. If there was poison, the chocolates were the key, but how to prove it? The body was gone, the opportunity for an autopsy lost. The chocolates from the old box had already done their work, and the new box, untouched, was useless to me. I needed a confirmation, and I knew exactly where to start. I left the house at Avenue Louise, and sought out the doctor who had examined Beaumont's body. He was a cautious man, carefully wrapping his work in layers of medical jargon, as though trying to shield himself from doubt. "Heart failure," he repeated, his expression unreadable, a sudden rush of blood to the brain, perhaps triggered by, but there was no outburst of anger. I interrupted. No shock, no warning, just a man, finishing his dinner, sitting comfortably in his study, then collapsing to the ground, lifeless. The doctor hesitated. A flicker of something crossed his face, uncertainty, perhaps even discomfort. "There have been cases," he admitted, "where a moment's stress can cause stress." I leaned in. "From what?" "A heated discussion, an argument." He sighed. "You are aware, I assume, that Monsieur Beaumont and his guest, Monsieur de Saint-Alard, were frequently at odds." "I am. Their debates grew more intense recently. Church and state, an old battle, but one they fought with renewed fervor." The doctor folded his hands. "It is not impossible that words were exchanged that evening. Perhaps in the heat of discussion, his body failed him." I nodded slowly. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone decided to end the argument permanently." He gave me a sharp look. "You suspect foul play?" I reached into my coat, withdrew the small empty box, and set it before him. "Tell me, doctor, what if the cause of death wasn't the heat of debate, but something far more deliberate, something he consumed, believing it harmless?" The doctor hesitated. "If that were the case," he murmured, "then I suggest you waste no time, monsieur, because whoever planned this did so with precision, and if they succeeded once, they may not hesitate to do so again." A chill ran through me. The answer lay within those chocolates, and if I wanted the truth, I had to move fast before the killer realized they had left a clue behind. This revelation was unexpected, and it gave me much to ponder. If poison had been introduced into the chocolates, then the murder had been committed with chilling precision. A single seemingly innocent treat had become the instrument of death. But was it possible? Could a lethal dose be concealed in something so ordinary? I turned to the doctor. "One more question, doctor. Would it be possible to introduce a fatal dose of poison into a chocolate?" The doctor considered the question carefully. "It is possible, I suppose," he said slowly. "Pure prussic acid would do the job. If administered correctly, it could kill within moments. But the problem is evaporation. It is highly volatile." I frowned. "And something less obvious, something that might not arouse suspicion. A chocolate laced with morphine or strychnine would certainly be effective," the doctor admitted, his lips curling slightly in distaste. "One bite would be enough. The victim wouldn't have time to notice anything amiss before it was too late." I nodded. That was exactly what I needed to know. Next, I turned my attention to the chemists in the area, particularly those near Avenue Louise. Being of the police had its advantages. I was able to obtain information with surprising ease. However, after thorough questioning, I found nothing suspicious. No purchases of lethal substances, no recent unusual transactions, except for one. One chemist recalled supplying atropine sulfate eye drops to the household of Monsieur Beaumont. For a fleeting moment, my heart leaped. Atropine was a powerful poison. Could this be the answer? But my excitement was short-lived. The chemist explained that the prescription was an old one, intended for Madame Beaumont, who had suffered from cataracts for years. Moreover, the symptoms of atropine poisoning did not match what I had observed. I was once again at a dead end. I turned away, frustration gnawing at me, when the chemist called out, "Monsieur Poirot, I just remembered, there was something else." The young woman who collected the atropine prescription mentioned needing to visit the English chemist afterward. "Perhaps you should try there." That was all I needed to hear. I wasted no time, and made my way to the English chemist. Once again I invoked my authority, and the information was given to me without hesitation. On the day before Monsieur Beaumont's death, the chemist had filled a prescription for Mr. John Wilson. At first glance, it seemed routine, nothing extraordinary, but when I pressed for details, I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. The prescription had not been for a liquid or a powder, it had been for small tablets of trinitrin. I kept my face impassive, but inwardly my thoughts raced. "May I see one of these tablets?" I asked. The chemist obliged, retrieving a small bottle. He poured a few of the tablets into his palm, and at that moment, my suspicions solidified into certainty. The tablets were chocolate. I lifted one, turning it over between my fingers. A seemingly harmless treat, identical to any ordinary confection, but I knew better. "Is it a poison?" I asked, my voice calm, despite the storm raging in my mind. "No, monsieur," the chemist assured me. "It is not a poison in the traditional sense. Trinitrin is used to lower blood pressure. It is prescribed for heart conditions such as angina pectoris. It relieves arterial tension in cases of arteriosclerosis." My mind pieced the puzzle together at once. This was no coincidence. Monsieur Beaumont had been given a steady diet of chocolates, his favorite indulgence, and now I knew that a lethal substitution had taken place. I interrupted the chemist sharply, impatience creeping into my voice. "Enough with the medical explanations. Tell me plainly, what happens if a man with normal blood pressure consumes a large quantity of this?" The chemist hesitated. "It would cause a dangerous drop in blood pressure. The effects could be severe: dizziness, fainting, and in extreme cases death. And if the person had already eaten a full meal, if his body was in a relaxed state, perhaps seated comfortably after dinner," the chemist exhaled, "it could cause a collapse, a complete shutdown of the cardiovascular system. If no one intervened quickly enough, the victim would not survive." A slow chill ran through me. This was it, the answer I had been seeking. Someone had deliberately swapped Monsieur Beaumont's beloved chocolates for these tablets. Each night he unknowingly ingested just enough to weaken his system, and on the final night, the dosage had been increased. A seemingly natural death, no traces of poison, no outward signs of foul play, a perfect crime. But there was one flaw in the killer's plan. They had not accounted for me. I straightened my coat and thanked the chemist, stepping back into the cold air of Avenue Louise. My next move was clear. I needed to confront John Wilson, because now I knew, Monsieur Beaumont had not died by chance. He had been murdered. The chemist hesitated before answering. "It causes the face to flush." "Certainly," he admitted. I leaned in slightly, "And if I were to consume, say, 10 or 20 of these tiny tablets?" His expression hardened. "I would strongly advise against it." "And yet," I continued, watching him carefully, "you insist that it is not a poison." The chemist exhaled, shaking his head. "Monsieur, there are many things in this world that are not classified as poisons, but can still kill a man." His words struck me. That was the key. A poison that was not a poison, a substance that could kill without raising suspicion. I left the shop, my mind racing, my pulse quickening. At last the case was beginning to unfold. I now knew that John Wilson had possessed the means to commit the crime, but what about the motive? Wilson had come to Belgium on business. He had been staying with Monsieur Dirac, a man he knew only slightly, yet enough to request hospitality. From all appearances, there was no clear way in which Dirac's death could benefit him. Yet my instincts whispered otherwise. I turned my inquiries to England, digging into Wilson's past. What I discovered was intriguing. He had been suffering for years from angina, a painful heart condition that made the use of trinitrin not only reasonable but necessary. It explained why he had these tablets in his possession. And yet, I was not satisfied. Someone had tampered with that chocolate box. Of that I was certain. The mistake had been in opening the new box first, a slip that had revealed the truth. The previous box had been altered. The last chocolate had been emptied of its sweet filling, and in its place, someone had carefully packed as many trinitrin tablets as it could hold. But who had done it? 2 guests had been in that house. John Wilson had the means. Saint Allard had the motive. I paused, considering the latter. The man was a religious fanatic, a zealot whose convictions had driven a wedge between himself and the victim, and there is no fanatic quite like a religious fanatic, capable of anything in the name of a higher cause. Could he in some way have obtained Wilson's trinitrin? A new idea crept into my mind, subtle but persistent. Why had Wilson run out of his medication? A man suffering from a serious heart condition would not leave England without an adequate supply, unless of course someone had stolen it. I wasted no time. I returned to the house in Avenue Louise and requested an audience with Wilson. He was out. No matter, there were other ways to get information. I sought out Felice, the maid responsible for attending to his room. "Tell me, Felice," I said casually, "was it not true that Mr. Wilson lost a small bottle from his washstand some time ago?" Her reaction was immediate. She clasped her hands together, her eyes lighting up with urgency. "Yes, monsieur, it is true. I was blamed for it, but I swear I never touched it." I nodded encouragingly. "And yet, Mr. Wilson believed you had." "Ah, the English gentleman thought perhaps I had broken it, and was too afraid to say," she said indignantly. "But I did nothing. I clean his room, yes, but I never touch his belongings." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "It was Jeanette, I tell you, always sneaking about where she should not be, always poking her nose where it does not belong." A flicker of understanding passed through me. I let her finish her rant, then took my leave, my suspicions now firmly cemented. Someone had stolen Wilson's trinitrin. Someone had inserted the tablets into Dirac's chocolates, turning a simple indulgence into a weapon of silent murder. I now had a clear picture of the crime, but what I did not yet have was the final proof. That I would uncover soon enough, because now I was certain. Monsieur Dirac had not died by misfortune. He had been executed, and the killer had made only one mistake. They had underestimated me. I now knew everything I needed to know. The pieces had fallen into place. The picture was clear, but knowing was not enough. I had to prove it, and that I knew would not be easy. I was certain that Saint Allard had stolen the bottle of trinitrin from John Wilson's washstand. The pieces fit too perfectly for it to be coincidence, but certainty was not evidence, and without evidence, my certainty meant nothing. I had no witness, no physical proof, just the weight of logic pressing down on me like an unrelenting force. Never mind, I had been in this position before. I thought back to the Styles case, how I had known the truth, but it had taken me time to find that final irrefutable link in the chain, the one link that would turn my suspicions into undeniable proof. For now I needed information, and I knew exactly where to look. I requested an interview with Mademoiselle Mézard. She came at once, her usual composed demeanor tinged with something else this time, hesitation, perhaps even unease. "I need the address of Monsieur de Santar," I told her. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. She hesitated. "Why do you need it, monsieur?" I studied her carefully. "It is necessary." She seemed troubled, unsure of how to respond. "He can tell you nothing," she insisted. "His thoughts are not of this world. He hardly notices what goes on around him." "Possibly, mademoiselle," I said smoothly. Nevertheless, he was an old friend of Monsieur Dirac. He may know things from the past, old grudges, old love affairs. At that she flushed, her lips pressed together, as though she was struggling to keep something from spilling out. "As you wish," she said finally. But she hesitated again, her gaze shifting. "I believe now that I was mistaken. It was foolish of me to involve you. I was upset, distraught at the time, but I see now that there is no mystery to solve. Let it go, I beg of you, monsieur." I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "Mademoiselle," I said, "a dog may struggle to find a scent, but once he has it, once he knows, it is impossible to make him let go." I held her gaze unwavering. "And I, mademoiselle, I am a very, very good dog." She looked away, without another word. She turned and disappeared into the house. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The hallway beyond the door seemed unnaturally still. Then at last she returned. Without speaking, she handed me a slip of paper, an address, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. I took it. "Where's she?" "Mademoiselle," I said quietly. She said nothing. I stepped out onto the street, where Francois was waiting for me. He studied my expression, his own full of quiet concern. "There is no news, monsieur?" he asked. "None yet, my friend," I replied. He sighed, his voice carrying a weary acceptance. "Ah, Poirot," he murmured. "I too am of your way of thinking." I nodded. The truth was so close now, but knowing the truth was one thing. Making the world see it, that was another matter entirely. I have never cared much for priests, not that I would dare say so within the house. The women were all devout, a good thing perhaps, or perhaps not. Madame Vere, was she? I thought back to the tear-streaked impassioned face I had seen that first day, the grief so raw, so consuming. Had that been the face of a devout woman, or merely one drowning in something far deeper, far darker? I wondered, but there was no time for wondering. I had the address of Monsieur de Saint-Lard, and so without delay, I set off. His chateau lay deep in the Ardennes, a solitary structure nestled amidst dense woodland, its walls whispering of secrets long buried. Yet, obtaining entry was another matter entirely. Days passed as I watched, observed, waited. He was a recluse, his household guarded, his movements unpredictable. In the end I found my way inside, and how, you ask? As a plumber, mon ami. A minor gas leak, so unfortunate, so inconvenient, and who better to fix it than an eager tradesman arriving at just the right hour, when the master of the house was conveniently absent. A simple ruse, a necessary one. I slipped inside with my tools, my senses sharp, my mind racing. What was I searching for? Proof, a missing piece, that one final thread, that would tighten the noose. And yet I knew, he would not be foolish enough to keep the evidence here. No, that would be absurd. But then, why did the cupboard above the washstand have a lock? I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The lock was old, simple, almost insultingly so. Within moments I had it open. My fingers trembled as I reached inside, sifting through dust-covered bottles, relics of ailments past, useless, worthless. And then, mon Dieu, my breath caught. A small glass vial, an English chemist's label, Trinit tablets, one to be taken when required. Mr. John Wilson. For a moment I could only stare. The weight of it in my hand felt heavy, final. This was it, the last link in the chain. I slipped the vial into my pocket, closed the cupboard, and with methodical precision, continued my charade, repairing the so-called gas leak with meticulous care. Then, without a second glance, I walked out of that house, and never looked back. The next train to Brussels carried me home. By the time I arrived, it was well past midnight. I worked late, drafting my report for the prefect, my mind a whirlwind of calculations and certainties. The case was clear now, the puzzle complete. And then, a knock at the door. A note was handed to me, scrawled in an elegant yet unmistakably urgent script. It was from Madame Dirac. She requested my presence at the Avenue Louise, at once. I wasted no time. Francois received me at the door, his expression unreadable. "Madame la Baronne is awaiting you," he said simply. He led me to her private apartments, where she sat, regal and unmoving, in a grand armchair. There was no sign of Madame Vere. "Mr. Poirot," the old lady said, her voice smooth as silk, yet laced with something else, something colder. I have just learned that you are not who you pretend to be. You are a police officer. I met her gaze without flinching. That is so, madame. You came here to investigate my son's death. Again, I answered evenly. That is so. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tightening over the carved arms of her chair. Then tell me, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, what have you discovered? I hesitated. Not because I lacked answers. No, I had them all. But first I needed to know. How, madame? I asked. How did you come to learn this? For just a fraction of a second, the flicker of a smile touched her lips. From someone, she murmured, and in that moment I knew I was no longer the only one hunting. From someone who is no longer of this world. Her voice was quiet, almost hollow, but each word was a dagger in the silence between us. There was something in the way she spoke, slowly, deliberately, that sent a shiver down my spine, a terrible finality. For the first time in many years I felt incapable of speech. My throat was dry, my mind raced. She observed me carefully before continuing, her eyes dark pools of something unreadable. And so, Monsieur Poirot, I beg of you urgently tell me what progress you have made in your investigation. I hesitated, for only a moment. Madame, I said, my voice steady, my investigation is finished. A slow nod. Then tell me, Monsieur Poirot, my son was killed deliberately, was he not? Yes, madame. And you know who is responsible? Yes, madame. She straightened slightly in her chair, her fingers clasped together with remarkable composure. Who then? I exhaled, my answer firm. Misty Mallard. A strange silence fell over the room. She did not react as I had expected, not shock, not grief, not even anger. Instead, she simply shook her head, a soft, almost pitying gesture. You are wrong, Monsieur Poirot, she said. Misty Mallard is incapable of such a crime. I stiffened. Madame, the proofs are in my hands. She sighed as though speaking to a child who had not yet grasped the weight of the world. And still you are wrong. A sense of unease crept over me. Then who, madame? Her eyes met mine, unwavering. It was I. The words landed like a thunderclap. I stared at her, my mind momentarily refusing to comprehend what I had just heard. But she sat there, calm, composed, nodding her head gently, as if confirming a fact as ordinary as the weather. It is well that I sent for you, she murmured. It is the providence of God that Virginie spoke before she left for the convent. She told me everything, what she had done, what she had seen. And so now, Monsieur Poirot, I will tell you. She inhaled deeply, as though gathering the strength to pull a burden from the depths of her soul. My son, she said, was an evil man. No mother wishes to speak so of her own flesh and blood, but I cannot turn away from the truth. He persecuted the church, he lived in sin, dragging others down with him, but that was not the worst of it. Her fingers tightened slightly over the armrests of her chair. I see you are a man of logic, Monsieur Poirot. You believe in evidence, in proof. But tell me, do you believe in the testimony of a mother's eyes? She did not wait for an answer. It was morning, I remember it clearly. The house was still, save for the sound of my daughter-in-law's footsteps on the landing. I saw her at the top of the grand staircase, reading a letter. She was lost in thought, unaware, and then I saw my son, moving silently behind her. A swift push, nothing more, just enough. She fell, a muscle twitched in her jaw. I heard the sickening crack as she struck the marble steps. I ran to her, but it was too late. My son stood above us both, watching, and then he walked away. I said nothing. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if she could still see the scene playing out behind her eyelids. No one suspected, she continued, her voice eerily even. An accident, they called it, a tragic fall, but I knew the truth. I knew it, and I lived with it. I lived with the knowledge that my son was a murderer, and no one else in this world knew it, no one but me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then she opened her eyes once more, her gaze sharp and unwavering. I could not allow it, Monsieur Poirot. I could not allow him to go unpunished, not by the law of men. And so I did what had to be done. My mouth felt dry. I exhaled slowly. You poisoned him. Yes, a single solemn nod. With my own hands I gave him what he deserved. There was no tremor in her voice, no remorse, only certainty. Now she said, you have the truth you sought. But tell me, Monsieur Poirot, what will you do with it? And for the first time in a long while, I did not have an immediate answer. You cannot conceive, Monsieur Poirot, of my agony, my despair, the torment of a mother who has seen the true face of the child she brought into this world. Her voice was quiet, but each syllable trembled with the weight of years. She sat upright, her frail hands clasped together, knuckles white with the effort of keeping her composure, yet in her eyes I saw something fierce, something unbreakable. What was I to do? She whispered. Denounce him to the police, deliver my own son to the guillotine. I could not bring myself to do it. She exhaled shakily, her chest rising and falling beneath the heavy folds of her gown. It was my duty, I knew that, but duty is a cold thing when it stands against the blood in your veins. Besides, she hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Would they have believed me? My eyesight had been failing for some time. They would have said I was mistaken, that I was an old woman given to delusions, misremembering the past, and so I kept my silence. Her voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper now, but silence can be a crime of its own, Monsieur Poirot. In keeping silent, I too became a murderer. The room was stifling, thick with the weight of her confession. I said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. My son inherited his wife's fortune, she went on. He flourished, grew in influence, like the green bay tree of Scripture, proud, untouchable, and now, he was to receive a minister's portfolio. His persecution of the church would be redoubled. He would spread his corruption further, tainting all he touched. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, and there was Virginie. Ah, poor child, she was beautiful, naturally pious, gentle, and she was drawn to him, fascinated, caught in the web he wove so easily around women. I saw it happening, but I was powerless to prevent it. Her hands trembled now, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress. He had no intention of marrying her. No, that was never his way. He had a power over women, a strange, terrible power. They saw only his charm, his brilliance, but I saw the truth. He would use her, consume her, and then discard what remained. And Virginie, poor innocent Virginie, she would have given everything for him. Her voice broke on the last word, but she recovered swiftly. That was when I saw my path clear. He was my son, I had given him life, and so it was my responsibility to take it from him. He had murdered once, destroyed a woman's body, now he would destroy another's soul. I would not allow it. She inhaled, her back straightening, as if steeling herself against what came next. I went to Mr. Wilson's room. I took the bottle of tablets. My son had once laughed about them, saying there were enough inside to kill a man. Her fingers tightened into fists. In his study, there was a large box of chocolates. Always there, always untouched, except by him. I meant to open it, to slip the tablets inside, but I made a mistake. I opened a new box by accident, and then I saw it. The other box was still on the table, nearly empty. Only one chocolate remained. A long silence, that simplified things. A cold chill ran through me, as I grasped the implication of her words. No one ate chocolates except my son and Virginie. That night, I kept her with me. I would not let her leave my side. She paused, closing her eyes as if reliving the moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost reverent. All went as I had planned. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. A weight settled in my chest. And now, madame, I said carefully, you place yourself in my hands. She nodded. They tell me I do not have many days left to live, she murmured. I am willing to answer for my actions before God. But tell me, Monsieur Poirot, must I answer for them on this earth as well? I hesitated. A moral dilemma, unlike any other. The law was clear, the evidence irrefutable, but justice was another thing entirely. And yet, madame, I said, buying myself time, the empty bottle. How did it come to be in Mr. St. Allard's possession? She sighed, shaking her head. When he came to bid me farewell, I slipped it into his pocket. I did not know what else to do with it. I cannot move about much on my own anymore, and had it been found in my rooms, suspicion would have fallen upon me. You understand, Monsieur Poirot." Her voice grew stronger now, firmer. "It was never my intention to cast doubt upon Mes de Saint Allard. I never dreamed it would lead to this. I merely thought his valet would find it, assume it was discarded, and throw it away. Nothing more." She lifted her chin, her frail form radiating a quiet dignity. "I am not afraid of what comes next, Monsieur Poirot." I bowed my head slightly. "I understand, madame," and for the first time in my career, I found myself unsure of what justice truly meant. "Madame," I said, my voice steady, though my mind was a whirlwind of conflicted thoughts. "And your decision?" She straightened in her chair, her frail body exuding an air of quiet authority. Though the weight of years was upon her, her spine remained unbent, her resolve unwavering. Her lips, once trembling with confession, were now set in a firm line. "It is done, monsieur," she replied, "and I will not recant." I rose to my feet, my eyes never leaving hers. "Madame," I said solemnly, inclining my head slightly, "I have the honor to wish you good day." And with that, I walked away, the heavy silence pressing upon my back like a spectre. For a long moment, Poirot did not speak. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the table, his usually sharp gaze clouded with reflection. Then at last he sighed. "She died a week later," he said simply. "As for Mademoiselle Virginie, she completed her novitiate, and took the veil. A life spent in devotion, safe from the shadows that once threatened to consume her." There was a finality to his words, and yet something still lingered, a trace of regret perhaps, or was it something else? "But surely, Poirot," I interjected, "that was not a failure on your part. What else could you have done?" Poirot's demeanor changed instantly, his usual self-assurance flickered, replaced by something uncharacteristic, self-reproach. He sat up, his fingers locking together as he leaned forward, eyes suddenly burning with intensity. "Ah, mon ami," he exclaimed, "do you not see? I was an imbecile, a fool of the grandest order. The answer was before me the entire time, and yet," he shook his head in frustration, "my little grey cells, they failed me. I failed myself." "But how?" I asked, frowning. "The clue was in my hands all along," Poirot said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "The chocolate box, my friend. It was the chocolate box that should have told me everything." I blinked. "The chocolate box," he nodded fervently, his fingers tapping the table with urgency. "Think, Hastings, a woman who has perfect vision does not mistake the lid of one box for another. But Madame Derard, her eyesight was failing, the atropine drops. Do you not remember? I knew she had cataracts, and yet I did not see what was right in front of me." Realization struck like a bolt of lightning. "Good heavens, Poirot," I murmured. He gave a bitter chuckle. "And then my psychology. Ah, my greatest failure of all. Had M. de Saint Allard truly been the murderer, he have kept an incriminating bottle in his possession. No, Hastings, finding that bottle was proof of his innocence, not his guilt. I had already been told by Mademoiselle Virginie that he was absent-minded, a man who forgot things, misplaced them, and yet I allowed the weight of circumstantial evidence to cloud my vision." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Ah, what a miserable affair, and yet I have recounted it to you, Hastings, only to you, because I wish for you to understand." I studied him, sensing the rare vulnerability beneath his words. "You comprehend, mon ami. I did not figure well in this tale. An old woman committed a crime, so simple, so clever, that I, Hercule Poirot, was entirely deceived." He sighed once more, though this time, his expression softened. "But my friend," he said, a glimmer of amusement creeping back into his voice, "let this be our little secret. Yes, if ever you find me growing too insufferably proud." He leaned forward, eyes twinkling now. "You need only say to me, 'Chocolate box.'" I chuckled. "It's a bargain." Poirot leaned back with satisfaction, as though some great burden had been lifted from him. "After all," he mused, "even the finest brain in Europe must suffer an occasional defeat. It is the price of genius, non." I only smiled, lighting another pipe, as the warm glow of the fire flickered between us. Some mysteries, I thought, were not meant to be solved by mere men. Some were best left in the hands of time. Thank you very much for listening to this story narrated by Dr. Rami. Don't forget to subscribe to the Curious Case channel, and be sure to leave a comment.